Hello and welcome to Real Atheology. My name is Justin Schieber and I'm here with my friend Ben Watkins. Ben is a graduate student of philosophy whose background is mostly in philosophy of religion, moral philosophy, and philosophy of mind. We're going to be briefly discussing an argument relating the apparent physical dependency of minds to the question of God's existence. Various forms of the argument have been advocated and presented by philosophers like Michael Tooley, Paul Draper, and Thomas Nagel. So Ben, as we get to this argument, we could start by briefly you giving a kind of nutshell version of what the main purpose of this argument is.
Yeah, so I guess it would probably be useful to start by first defining some terms. What I'm really interested in is the discussion between theists and naturalists. So that introduced two terms that we have to define from the start, one being naturalism and the other being theism. And so by naturalism, I'm just using that as a label. And I mean that to refer to a hypothesis that physical reality exists and that any mental reality is ultimately explained by this physical reality. So in this view, the physical world would have ontological priority. So if naturalism's true, there are no purely mental beings which can exist apart from a physical body. And so there's no such being like God or any person much like God. And by theism, I mean a subset of a hypothesis that's contrasted with naturalism called supernaturalism, which is it's a symmetric claim as naturalism. It's the hypothesis that a mental reality exists and that any physical reality is ultimately explained by that mental reality. So in that view, a mental reality would have ontological priority because you would have God creating a physical world. And if supernaturalism is true, then there's no purely physical matter which can just exist without some sort of mental creator. So from that hypothesis, I have the foundation for theism, which I mean the hypothesis that there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly moral person who created the universe for a purpose and is worthy of our worship. So I think with those two definitions of naturalism and theism in place, I think you can then have conversations about which way does evidence fall.
Sure.
Paul Draper has just a very brilliant framework in which he just lays out evidence for what explains reality better, this hypothesis of naturalism or this hypothesis of theism. And what Paul Draper and Michael Tooley did is they developed this argument from physical minds. And so basically what it says that naturalism better explains our current knowledge of how minds work and that minds are physically dependent. And so that's evidence favoring naturalism, at least prima facie. And
sure. So you're talking about evidence relating to the kind of relationship between minds and physical brains. So I guess what kind of observations are we talking about here? Are we talking about the fact that, if we damage one particular part of the brain, we might lose one particular mental capacity? Is that the kind of thing we're interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's certainly part of it. There's really a body of evidence that calls for an explanation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that human persons exist on this planet, and all those healthy persons have minds with rich conscious experiences and personalities. And so we kind of take that as a datum. And so neuroscience, in particular, in studying these phenomena that we find in the world, have noticed that our observations strongly imply that conscious states and personality are highly dependent on physical processes in the brain.
Sure.
So in this context, we know of nothing mental happening without something physical happening. And so Michael Tooley lays out 5 lines of evidence for this. And I can kind of run through give kind of the, he unpacks these a bit in more detail in his book with Alvin Plantinga called The Knowledge of God. But to just hit on the bare bones of them, when an individual's brain is directly stimulated and put into a certain physical state, that causes the person to have a corresponding experience. So if we were to cut open someone's the top of their skull, and we were to stimulate certain regions of someone's brain, they would then report to us having certain mental states. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a baseline, the first line of reasoning. And certain injuries to the brain make it impossible for persons to have any mental states at all. So if I were to, shoot you in the brain, you would cease to have mental capacities like memory, self-awareness, personal identity, conscious experiences in general. And other injuries to the brain destroy various mental capacities as well. And which capacity is destroyed is tied directly to the particular region of the brain that was damaged. So degenerative diseases like Alzheimer affect neurons that are the causal, what's the way I want to say this, for memory, the causal link to memory. So by destroying those neurons in certain regions of the brain, you destroy certain capacities for memory, which of course are essential for mental states like personal identity, to just have any concept of self. You need those physical states. When we examine the mental capacities of animals, they become more complex as their brains become more complex. So this is a really striking piece of evidence if we were to start talking in terms of souls. So it would be very mysterious on kind of a substance dualist view where there's souls for human persons, but other animals would have these physically dependent minds. So unless we're willing to, think that animals also have disembodied souls, these sort of facts seem very strange on a substance dualist interpretation, but are exactly what you would expect if mental states were causally necessary, had a necessary causal relationship with physical states. And this actually has a lot of implications for things like the afterlife. So hypotheses that include things like the afterlife are presupposing disembodied minds. So, I mean, we can say one of the consequences of this argument is that we can say pretty confidently that the mind doesn't survive death. Once that there's once physical activity is stopped, mental activity will cease as well. So plenty of things will go on after you die. You just won't be aware of it. Basically, what Michael Tooley lays out is that his argument can kind of be summed up. All known mental activity has a physical basis in embodied brains. And so we can infer from this that disembodied minds probably don't exist. That's an a posteriori argument. So it's not to say that disembodied minds are logically impossible. It's just to say, given what we know about the nature of minds, disembodied minds are improbable. Well, theism posits the existence of at least one disembodied mind, God, and also gives us antecedent reason to expect other sorts of disembodied minds like souls or angels or perhaps even demons. And so this argument kind of, it says that those sorts of beings are improbable. And so that gives us a strong inductive case to say that entities such as gods, souls, demons, and angels probably don't exist.
Okay, interesting. So how does the argument actually work? Like, what's the kind of form of the argument? Are you comparing just the explanatory power of theism and naturalism with regard to their, their ability to explain these observations then? Is that how we're going about this then?
That's certainly a way to formulate it without getting too into the weeds as far as the technical formulation.
Sure.
Basically, the argument goes, minds are known to be physically dependent. The physical dependency of minds is much more probable on the assumption that naturalism is true than if theism is true. So other things being equal, the physical dependency of minds is prima facie evidence favoring naturalism over theism. So that's not to say that naturalism is the best hypothesis, all things considered, but
Sure.
this is certainly, you would put this piece of evidence on the scale in favor of naturalism.
So it's an all else being equal, this evidence would tip the scale toward
Sure, I think that's the modest claim, and I think
Sure.
that's the most reasonable one to put forward.
All right, what is some of the, I guess, the antecedent reasoning behind this?
So I don't think that theists can plausibly maintain that theism simpliciter would lead us to expect that minds would be physically dependent. I just don't think that they have the conceptual resources available to make that claim. It would have to be theism simpliciter plus some story about why God would prefer physically dependent minds. And so I think those sorts of responses will always have to face an objection of being ad hoc.
Sure. Meanwhile, on naturalism, if there's any consciousness at all, by definition, it must be...
it has to be physically dependent.
At the very least, causally dependent upon...
so naturalism doesn't entail consciousness. So
Sure.
Consciousness, I think, can plausibly be said to be evidence for theism generally, but I think that any force that argument has is immediately undercut once you have the more particular fact
Sure.
that those minds that do exist are physically dependent. That favors naturalism. So I don't think you can be as confident as that more general claim that consciousness is evidence for theism because of this undercutting defeater, that what we know about minds is that they're physically dependent. So theism doesn't entail minds would be physically dependent at all. In fact, theism predicts that we would have immaterial souls. That's one of the large motivations for the substance dualist view.
Mm-hmm.
And this is for the simple reason that theism entails the existence of at least one disembodied mind, God's mind. Right. And so that leads. So it's disembodied minds are not some speculative entity on theism. Theism entails at least one. So that gives us a strong reason to think that the mental states like personality and consciousness would be at bottom, mental and not physical. All know mental activity having a physical basis in embodied brains strongly implies that minds cannot exist independent of physical matter. And so naturalism entails that. So I think that because you have this entailment relationship with naturalism that theism doesn't have, I think right there you have naturalism does a better job explaining this. Right. All those 5 facts that I mentioned earlier about correlations with brain states and complexity of animals getting more, mental states become more complex as physical structures get more complex. None of that is mysterious if naturalism is true, but I think that it requires rather ad hoc explanations on theism to really make sense of these facts. All of a sudden, theism gets very, very complex in order to have to explain all these things. In a way that naturalism just doesn't have to be.
As you said, one of the problems with the theistic response is going to be that a lot of these are ad hoc, that any attempt to try and make theism yield these kinds of observations would seem pretty ad hoc and seem like you're inventing the story as you go along. But let me take a crack at it here. So, what if a theist were to disagree with you and say that actually the probability of these observations is not really all that unlikely on theism? So a theist could posit that given God's kind of plausible desire to create moral agents in interesting moral situations, God could very likely want to create ways in which those decisions of humans could causally affect the minds of themselves and others. God would likely want to make it the case that ingesting certain chemicals or, affecting certain brain chemistry and other ways would affect other persons. So persons having the ability to affect other persons, just as, it's valuable to have a morally interesting situation where one restrains themselves from imposing physical harm on another person's physical body. The same could be done, or the same could be said of psychological health, for example. And so this is a way in which, so making it the case that persons affecting other persons' brains by either smacking them with a baseball bat or, putting drugs in their drink or, in whatever way they might choose, that this is a way that God could bring about interesting moral situations where people are allowed to do these things because the very fact of their moral choice is a good thing. So by allowing this interaction with brains and minds and the connection therein, God is allowing a broader ability to make moral decisions, a new area in which we can affect other persons and, for good or for harm, right?
Well, so I would go back to what I said earlier, where it sounds more like theism simpliciter plus some story.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that story being that there's antecedent reason to believe that God would, for some reason, want a physical world, which theism simpliciter doesn't entail, and that this physical world would somehow be the only way that God could have brought it about to have things like moral agents. So if I think that you could have a morally significant world without a physical world, you could have a disembodied world of angels. Presumably heaven is this morally significant place of disembodied minds that isn't dependent on, physical structures in any way.
Sure.
Theists also like to put a lot of emphasis on free wills, particularly of a libertarian variety, which require these immaterial substances. So it seems to me that just putting mental activity in a physical structure right there, just, one of the things that theists like to appeal to about philosophy of mind is that there are these immaterial substances, and that's how we explain our experiences of free will. And so I think that's just that theism plus that story has a lot of tensions with other commitments that theists may have. And I think at the end of the day, you would just find that response is just ad hoc. It just doesn't fall into play. It feels like the pieces are being forced to fit together. Mm-hmm. Whereas we just have the naturalistic hypothesis is just a better explanatory hypothesis, just because it doesn't require all of these different stories or bring along all these other tensions with other beliefs. Everything fits.
Okay. Good. A while back, Paul Draper had a debate with William Lane Craig, and in that debate, he used this argument among many. And William Lane Craig actually responded by objecting to his interpretation of the observations that we talked about earlier. Craig argued that, quote, theists who are dualist interactionists. They would say that the relationship between the brain or the body is like the relationship between a musician and a piano. The musician produces his music by means of the piano, and that it is not surprising then that damage to the brain would result in mitigated consciousness. So in the same way that damage to a piano, you'd expect even the most excellent piano player to not be able to play a broken piano to sound particularly inspiring. So it's a matter of the hardware, right, at issue here. So Craig is saying that, look, this doesn't change personality of persons. This doesn't change the self, the sense of self. This doesn't change, our particular ability to recognize faces. All this does is damage the equipment such that we behave in a particular way, even though inside, wherever that is, our soul has a completely different intent, and the body's just gone haywire. What do you think about a view like that? That it doesn't seem to be a terribly satisfying answer.
I certainly don't think so either. And I think for a lot of the same reasons that are already mentioned, that first off, that view, an interaction dualist view, immediately faces that interaction problem that I told
Right.
you about. How does this immaterial substance causally interact with a physical world? And so you said that William Lane Craig objected to the interpretation in that debate and then offered this other interpretation. Well, I would say that that interpretation is ad hoc. I think that that interpretation doesn't fit the data as well as the interpretation that Michael Tooley was offering.
That Paul Draper was offering, but yeah.
Paul Draper, I'm sorry, you're right.
Sure.
It's a clever analogy that to help illustrate the concept of this musician playing an instrument. But if you start looking at that analogy a little bit closer into, I said that animals, the complexity of mental states in animals are, increase with complexity as you move up in neural complexity. Are we to, expect that animals are also like musicians and, things like mental states like memory are physically dependent too. If a musician's instrument is damaged, he doesn't forget how to play music. You're already in that analogy. It's an intentional agent using an instrument for a purpose. Are we intentional? Immaterial, intentional agents intentionally using a body for a purpose? If so, when we got say we got a bump on the head and we didn't have any conscious experiences because of it, because our body was damaged. When we finally came to, we should have memories of trying to use, this physical body, and it just wasn't working. Like my mind was still there,
Right.
trying to put, I had all these intentions, but my body just wouldn't work. But that's not what we observe. So I think when you really look at all those evidences that I lined up and you put the interaction dualist interpretation up against the sort of interpretation that naturalism will put up, I don't think it's even close. I think the interpretation is clearly the naturalistic one better explains that data.
It would seem nice, if our grandparents suffering from like a dementia of some sort, that they're still in there perfectly, exactly. mentally there, but that their body's just unable to express it in words, or their body's unable to describe memories, or to describe that they recognize a face, even though internally they do.
Get someone back, that the kind of hope that in the future, that as Alzheimer's research improves, and that we'll be able to start reversing the effects of Alzheimer's, and then we get people back. And I think that these sorts of arguments kind of undercut a lot of hope that may be there for people. So there's certainly a motivational aspect where I would the conclusions of these arguments are impalpable. Not being able to survive death, not being able to get loved ones back that have suffered, brain injuries. Those aren't the most pleasant conclusions. Right. But then again, how satisfying emotionally arguments are doesn't tell us a whole much about their soundness.
Right.
So as philosophers, we're called to test ideas and see let the evidential chips fall where they may, to borrow an Evan Fales line.
Sure. Well, all right, Ben. Thanks a whole bunch for coming on to Relay Theology to discuss this argument from the physical dependency of minds.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care, man.
Take care, Justin.